I'm going to talk a little bit about beef today, and as you can see from the title, it's what's the beef with beef, as there certainly seems to be a fair amount of controversy around what should be, I believe, an essential food. So to get into this, I think let's talk about the business of disease from the viewpoint of a gastroenterologist or a doctor. So to get disease, I'm fairly certain you need to disconnect farming from nature. When you do this, you have the rise of disease in human beings. This obviously requires the pharmaceuticals. You then train a workforce of people like myself who are largely oblivious to the link. And this is probably should be a summary slide, but I thought I'd start with this. Meat's been an essential part of the human diet. We cannot debate nor doubt this. Without it, the human brain certainly would not have developed. There are some that argue that seafood was also a critical part of our diet, and that's when the brain showed a massive explosion in size and complexity. But we've been eating meat for millions of years. I don't think I need to justify that to anyone here. However, what has occurred? Let's look at what happened about 9,000 years ago. Something occurred that made us shift to farming grains and crops and vegetables. It came with many advantages. Like if you're going to build a civilization and not be a nomadic hunter-gatherer, you need a stable point, and civilization arose from farming. The two are interlinked. So civilization's given us math, it's given us legal code, it's given us religion, it's given us a lot of good things. But certainly 9,000 years ago, 9 to 10,000 years ago, we saw a decline in human health. Issues with dentition, our teeth, which often signify chronic inflammation. We've got a couple of dentists in the crowd today, so I'm sure they'll agree with this. We started seeing the rise of dental issues. We saw the rise of thinner bones. Our stature shrunk, and our brain shrunk about 180 cc. So we potentially, I mean, if you think a larger brain constitutes more intelligence, which it does, we've become less intelligent in the agrarian revolution. So, you know, I don't like the fact that we paint ancient man as a bit of a brute, because I suspect they were a lot more sophisticated than we think and give them credit for. So forget 9,000 years ago. Let's go to 30 to 80 years ago. We've now got industrial agriculture. We've got pesticides, hormones, mechanization, chemical manipulation of food, separation of forest and farm, fast foods, globalization, food out of season, genetic manipulation. So all of this has occurred within a century. And I suspect while it is increased yield of food, the quality of our food supply has certainly diminished significantly. This is a cracking slide. It's a 4,000-year-old Sumerian recipe book. 25 recipes in it, 21 are for meat and 4 are for vegetable stews. With the vegetable stews, a critical ingredient is animal fat. Okay, so you can see we've always valued animal-sourced foods. Just a little bit about myself. So as I said, I'm a gastroenterologist. I'm married. That's my lovely wife, Tamara. She comes from a country background, her long line of cattle ranchers. I've got 3 kids, all of which took after her. They've all got very fair skin. My last one's got blonde hair. Some of them have blue eyes. So for Christmas, I just wanted a dog that looked similar to me, and that's what I ended up with. So look, I'm a broken man. I think I've spent 20 years in the medical industry, and I've really been unhappy with the approach to healthcare. And I think the fact that we fail to acknowledge root cause has been a problem. This is a fantastic Upton Sinclair quote. I think you guys would have heard this before. You cannot make somebody understand something if their salary depends on them not understanding it. We are incentivized by disease, and I'll explain how in a few slides. So this is me leaving medical school to combat lifestyle-based illness with absolutely no training on lifestyle. Question, I think I don't need to preach to the converted here, but like from a clinical perspective, I see many thousands of patients every year. What do the masses that I see, and these are highly educated people, you know, professional people, what do they think about red meat and health? What I've come to realize is that the crowd is fundamentally a gathering place where this madness begins. Insanity basically runs rampant And within this asylum, the lunatics have basically gained control. Okay? So most of the people that I see, good, down-to-earth people, they genuinely believe red meat causes disease. They genuinely believe it contributes to cancer, heart disease, and this is how they've been conditioned. The medical world, my world, we promote this and have done so for many decades. We are now seeing in the last few years the rise of plant-based doctors, and they are pushing these lifestyles onto patients. Like, I remember taking my 90-year-old grandmother to see the doctor, and grandmothers being grandmothers, they don't want to listen to what their grandson's got to say. So I remember her asking her doctor, what diet do I need to go to eat to make sure that my body doesn't fall apart, because she was obviously developing fragility and frailty. And what she was told was a high-fiber diet. She died a brittle diabetic. It was very sad to see. Meat causes disease. Hasn't been my personal experience. That's my old man. He's a dentist, smart guy, followed the dietary guidelines from about 40 onwards, ate a lot of grain, minimised his meat intake, and was floridly diabetic by 50. When he moved from New Zealand to Australia to be with me, he was on insulin 4 times a day, three to 4 times a day, multiple medications, just didn't look well. That's him now. He's lost about 15 kilos of weight, and beef was a critical part of him being able to do this. It took him to surrender his ego to listen to his son, but he did, and it's been a fantastic recovery for him, and he's not on any medications at the moment. But this should be everyone's story. I think the human body is capable of self-healing, and the medical industry simply has taken it out of your hands. Let's take cancer as an example. It's a leading cause of death in Australia. It's increasing in prevalence and incidence. Rates are expected to increase by about 60% in the next 16 years. Enormous rise. And we're seeing more and more cancer in young, supposedly healthy people. Beef's been blamed, but you can see this graph from 1962 to 2015. This shows meat consumption in Australia. Poultry is drastically increasing, as you can see here in this orange line. Beef, actually, in the last maybe decade or so, the inputs or the intakes actually dropped off quite significantly. That's in 2015. 8 years down the track now, with inflation inflating beef to up to 40% above prices. Like, I'd like to see the beef intake now. I suspect it's dropped dramatically in these last 3 years as we've seen this financial crisis or debasement of currency reduce our purchasing power of beef. So where does this decision that meat and disease are synonymous come from? And to understand that, you have to look at a global body, a centralized body called the World Health Organization, and one of their sister arms, the IRAC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer. 2015, these guys met up, a panel of 22 of them, 14 of which I believe were heavily plant-based. All of them self-nominated. All of them had spent their career trying to prove red meat caused cancer. All of them met up, okay? And they determined cancer was a byproduct of red meat. There was one chap who wasn't on that path, where he wasn't plant-based or anything. He was more of an objective bloke. And he said it was the most frustrating day that he's ever experienced. My good friend Brian Sanders, you might know him as Food Lies. He's done an amazing podcast with this gentleman, and it's really quite revealing as to what happened on this day. They basically took 800 epidemiological studies in any fields of science. Epidemiology is the weakest level of evidence. 780 showed no link between processed meat and cancer, or red meat and cancer. Showed no link. 780 of those 800 studies, but about a handful, 20 of them showed a possible link. So they focused on those 20 and discounted the 780. I'm not making this up. This is legitimate, okay? And it shows you the level of corruption. They looked at something called the absolute risk. And when you look at absolute risk, it doesn't look impressive. You know, the lifetime absolute risk of bowel cancer in vegetarians is about 4.5 out of 100. In people eating 50 grams of processed meat every day for a lifetime, the risk is 5.3 out of 100. Okay, so this is the raw data. absolute risk doesn't look all that impressive. They're not statistically distinguishable. And you can see it's slightly increased, but think about it. What sort of individual eats 50 grams of processed meat every day for a lifetime? It's probably the type of person who's eating pizzas, burgers, along with French fries, milkshakes, whatever. There's significant bias that comes into it. From poor quality evidence, they extrapolated something called relative risk, which always looks more impressive than absolute risk. And the relative risk was 18% for those who ate processed meat. Now, somehow they extended that to red meat as well and came up with this blanket decision that processed and red meat causes cancer. But it's a circular argument because they only really looked at processed meat and only determined the numbers for processed meat. Let's compare this with other known carcinogens. We know that eating moldy grains contaminated with aflatoxin can cause liver cancer. Okay, we know this. We know smoking causes lung cancer. That's a no-brainer. The relative risk, not absolute risk, the relative risk of lung cancer from smoking is 3,000%. So that's what real risk looks like, not 18%, 3,000%. Relative risk for liver cancer from eating moldy grains contaminated with aflatoxin, about 600%. You compare that to the piddly 18% that the World Health Organization was able to determine from epidemiological studies in people eating processed meat every day. So you can see that there has been a significant hit job on red meat from the World Health Organization. We can talk about why that is, and that's probably outside the scope of my talk. But to me, that's a sinister decision because it's been implemented by basically every health system globally, because they're a centralized body. That's what the World Health Organization is. In fields outside nutrition, the usual threshold for confidence about 200 to 400% for you to be guardedly confident. So today's standard calls, after that World Health Organization analysis, for something called a systematic review and meta-analysis. They never did any of that. In fact, there were randomized control trials, which are a higher quality of evidence, which were completely ignored by the World Health Organization. Instead, what we got were groups like Cancer Council. I mean, you can see it right down the bottom there. Increase high fiber foods, improve your diet by eating more whole grains, vegetables, fruits, legumes, and less processed and red meat. So basically, Jacob's grass-fed, finished, regeneratively farmed beef is on that hit list of poor quality eating, according to the Cancer Council. All stems from the World Health Organization decision. We got Bowel Cancer Australia promoting meat-free week. We got Cancer Council telling parents not to pack ham for their kids, to ditch the ham sandwich. We've got people like Billy Gates telling governments that we should shift to synthetic beef and a more plant-based method of eating. And that, to write someone like Bill Gates off would be foolish, because they wield a huge amount of influence through bodies like the World Health Organization. His foundation is one of the biggest contributors to the World Health Organization budget. Not only is it a health issue now, it's a climate issue. It's imperative for survival unless we become plant-based, according to most of these headlines. Climate-friendly diets make a huge difference, even if you don't go all that vegan. So basically, they're pushing people from an environmental and health perspective towards a plant-based life. And now they'll start with our kids. The curriculum is about to change. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but they'll certainly be talking a lot more about vegetarianism and the environment and how our diet impacts on this. So they'll start it at a very, very early stage. So we'll essentially have a generation growing up believing that beef not only causes disease, but it is wrecking the environment. So one thing I tweeted a while ago is, imagine launching a war against red meat in a world awash with ultra-processed foods, packeted foods, and sugar-sweetened beverages. There's not really a focus on that, is there? It's a big, big focus on beef. Can doctors help us be healthy? Well, not really, because 70% of them are now either overweight or obese. And we have very little nutritional training, as I alluded to before. Most don't value movement, very few exercise. It's a difficult job, high-stress job, a lot of hours, high remuneration. The opportunity cost for 2 or an hour and a half of exercise is income lost. And it's one of those fields where they prioritise the job over their own health. I mean, you got clowns like this guy, the cardiologist who prescribes red wine, claiming that it can have a heart attack. I mean, this is just absolute rubbish. But red meat is painted as a villain. This is quite sinister. This was just a few weeks ago. You guys might have seen it on social media, but Dr. Stanford's an obesity doctor and a contributor to the US 2025 dietary guidelines. She claims diet and exercise have little to no impact on obesity. She says the number one cause of it is genetics. And this is misleading. When you place a person under environmental duress, there are these things called your mitochondria, and you know, without going into too much depth, but mitochondrial dysfunction probably relates to most diseases that we see. These mitochondria release components, reactive oxygen species and free radicals and whatnot, that modify your DNA. And this DNA is then passed on to the kids. It's intergenerational. This is a concept known as epigenetics. So obesity isn't genetic. Obesity is very much epigenetic, and it stems from the parents. So a child born to parents that are potentially overweight or obese is on the back foot because of epigenetics, but epigenetics can always be modified. Your environment will always be able to modify it. So really, the pursuit of health is no longer in the hands of the individual. When you've got our drinking water and food compromised, this is the responsibility of society, the collective. And a lot of what Texas Slim said really resonated with me. It is really all our responsibility. Great quote by Rachel Carlson. She says, I won't read the whole thing, but just the first line, the most alarming of all man's assaults is upon the environment. It's the contamination of air, earth, rivers, and seas with dangerous and even lethal materials. I point this out to my colleagues. I speak at medical conferences. I'm not invited to many medical conferences anymore, but when I used to, the consensus was that fundamentally that I was a conspiracy theorist or someone who's very ultra right wing. I mean, I don't know what my political beliefs have to do with anything. I was just simply pointing out food and our health is intimately connected. To understand the business of disease, we have to understand something called the military-industrial complex, okay? And you might wonder why I'm talking about it, but this will make sense. So in America, you've got Congress, which provides tax funding to the Department of Defense. They then issue tax-funded contracts to large military corporations like Raytheon or Lockheed Martin. They then provide campaign contributions to Congress, which then provide tax funding, and so that cycle continues. That is the military-industrial complex aided by something called lobbying. Now, 2022 alone has seen revenue in this business up 20 billion. Won't go into the reasons why, but I think most of us know that war is good business at the moment. President Eisenhower, when he departed, his departing speech warned of this. He said, beware of the military-industrial complex. This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is the new American experience, he said. In councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Is there a similar complex in healthcare? There is. It's the triad, the toxic triad, known as big food, big pharma, and the medical industrial complex. The business of disease. Competition is a sin, according to John D. Rockefeller, the father of modern medicine. But before Rockefeller unified all the medical universities in America, American medicine was a jumble of competing philosophies. They were all in open conflict with each other. As George Washington lay dying, President George Washington lay dying, physicians from Yale and Harvard proceeded to kill him by draining his blood, putting leeches on him, and injecting him with mercury subchloride. So this was the standard of medicine. So what John D. Rockefeller did was he was going to standardize it. So they came up with a standard curriculum, okay? And allopathic medicine was born. That's the field that I'm trained in. Allopathic medicine is, don't get me wrong, it's given us some amazing things. CT, antibiotics, MRIs, like it's great in acute medicine, but as allopathic doctors, and there's a few medical doctors in here that I can vouch for the fact that alternative systems of health, nutrition, lifestyle, exercise, sleep, all of that was removed from our curriculum. So fundamentally, we are born or rebirthed through these university degrees believing that disease is essentially a drug deficiency. which is an absolute bizarre state of mind. So Marsha Angel, she's Dr. Marsha Angel, the former editor of New England Journal of Medicine, said, over the past 2 decades, the pharmaceutical industry has moved very far from its original high purpose of producing useful drugs. Now they're a marketing machine. They sell drugs of dubious benefit. This industry uses wealth and power to co-opt every institution that might stand in its way, including the US Congress, the FDA, the academic medical centers, and the medical profession itself. The proportion of budget spent on marketing by drug companies is greater than the entire budget to train medical students in the US. I mean, you think about that. That budget, we're talking $5.5 billion. We're talking a lot of money. And 85% of the funding for research papers or research comes from the pharmaceutical companies. They hire the best statisticians, best epidemiologists. They know the result of the study before the study is even conducted, because that's how these things are designed. Let's talk a little bit about the birth of processed food. It's important to understand this. So after World War II ended, basically we had this situation where all this food that was developed for the war, which could basically survive unrefrigerated for many months, there was an excess supply of it once the war ended. So these companies went to the American government and said, how can we change it? So basically all these foods were then rebranded, sold to the American households as healthy and nutritious, and that was okay, but it started a race to the bottom, because from that processed foods came the hyper-palatable foods, as it became quite profitable, and it snowballed from there, and it became a multi-billion-dollar, possibly trillion-dollar industry, you know, when you talk about the food industry. It was essentially science for sale, and the Sugar Research Foundation grew in power. And what they did, this is a speech from Henry House, the president, in 1954. This speech basically talks about how it's important to increase the sugar content in our diet, and it would increase the per capita consumption of sugar to more than a third, with tremendous improvement in general health. So what they did, they spent money and time convincing the American public that sugar was the fuel that ran a human body, when we know fat is more than efficient fuel source for us. There was an attack on red meat, eggs, butter, all these sort of nutritious foods over time, over decades, slowly just conditioned against it. Hyperpalatable foods increased at the same time. This is no coincidence. As the nutritious foods are diminishing, the hyperpalatable foods arose. Now we're at a point where 75% of our food calories come from processed grain. That's your standard Australian diet. 25% come from whole foods. Protein intake for most Australians is actually pretty low. It's about 10%. So we're eating in a way where we can no longer keep up with the turnover of our body. The right protein intake to hit for the human body is probably about 30%. That's the magic number. So 3 times more than what we're eating, which is interesting. A little bit on the agricultural complex. I mean, this sounds really obvious, but 95% of food is produced in soil. So we need the soil to be healthy. Soil is where the life and food begins. Our soil is basically dying, not on farms like this, where Jacob's obviously doing it in a way his ancestors have done it for thousands of years. We don't see monocrop here. We don't see fertilizer use. Nutrient balance is probably something that's rare, but in modern farms, this is the norm, and it's a major global threat. Land degradation and loss of biodiversity. And when you lose your biodiversity in your soil, you lose it in your gut, okay? So your gut microbiome is basically, and we all agree it's a topical thing, everyone knows about the gut microbiome, we understand its importance, but we don't realize where the diversity comes from. We were told for many years to eat the rainbow, but that is not how diversity is gained. Diversity is gained from the diversity of the soil, not the food itself. So loss of gut diversity is called dysbiosis. Many factors contribute: antibiotics, medicine, stress, genetic factors, lifestyle, and most importantly, nutrition, obviously, and loss of contact with nature. Lovely to see the kids playing around in the dirt with dirt all over their face. That's probably how it should be done. Instead, we've engineered our populations to believe that, you know, high-rise living is normal, or that getting dirty is somehow unhygienic. When now we're using these crazy sanitizers everywhere as well. So a quick question that I ask myself is glyphosate a friend or a foe? So I decided to look to our most trusted authority, the Australian government, the APVMA, and they've said that products containing glyphosate are safe to use, no problems, according to label instructions, it's fine. And it is true to some degree because human beings lack enzymatic pathway that glyphosate blocks, which is the Shikimate pathway. Our cells don't have it, so they can justify that, saying, well, it doesn't block that pathway. You could drink glyphosate and be fine. But what do we know about glyphosate? The glyphosate in adults between the last 30 years, 1993 to 2016, has gone up about 1,500%. That's 15 times. And it's going up by hundreds of thousands of tons every year. 99% on this study, 99% of French adults tested with a urinary glyphosate tested positive for glyphosate. 80% of Americans test positive for glyphosate in their urine. And that's kids too, you know. Is the human microbiome sensitive to Roundup or glyphosate? Indeed it is. So as I said, the human cell isn't, but the microbiome, what you see there in the green is that which is sensitive to microbiome, the red is resistant. If you look at the gut, right, if you look at the gut microbiome, you can see 54% of our gut bacteria are fundamentally sensitive to glyphosate. So yes, we're not damaging human cells, but we're decimating the gut microbiome. And I suspect this is why guys like me in gastroenterology are not short of clients. It used to be the realms of naturopaths. You know, doctors used to poo-poo leaky gut a few years ago or a few decades ago. Now we know this phenomena exists. So leaky gut there is shown by the white. That's basically dye leaking from the gut into the gut lumen. And a gut with good integrity, you don't see that leak. It's a major driver of disease, in particular inflammation, and all modern illness basically stems from inflammation. So our gut should be like Fort Knox, a structure incapable of being penetrated except when the body needs it. Instead, we've got a house with huge holes through it, which freely communicates with an environment that is fundamentally broken. So when you look at autoimmune illnesses, things like type 1 diabetes, Crohn's disease, MS, some of these diseases in the last 50, 60 years are up 400 to 500%. That's 5 times increase. And where is the medical field in all of this? That cartoon depicts it. It's sort of a dog sitting with fires raging around it, claiming it's fine. We are not questioning why these diseases are rising. Instead, we put it down to genetics. I mean, if you've ever gone to your doctor with an illness and said, why did I get this? Why did I develop it? The fallback answer will be genes, genetics. But the major driver of how we express our genes is our environment. Just a final few slides. Does Roundup accumulate in animal source foods? You hear a lot of stories about people with illness that go on a carnivore-based diet, cut out all the wheat and carbohydrates, all this food, and just beef and salt. A lot of them end up improving their disease. A lot of that, I suspect, comes to the fact that meat is a filter. These animals are somehow a filter to the damage that we're doing to the environment. That is the mechanism of action. Are we a carnivore as human beings? No, we're not. We're an omnivorous species. We're an omnivorous species of primate capable of taking what we want from the environment, modifying the environment. Meat should be a big part of the diet. Our gut probably closely resembles that of a pig, which is also an omnivorous animal. We're also very similar to a dog in terms of our gut makeup because they learned to eat with us 60,000 years of eating the same thing by the campfires and civilization as well. So it's important to understand why a diet is successful. A lot of people do the carnivore diet long term. I'm not sure it needs to be that strict if the environment around us was good. As I said, like if we can fix the gut, go towards more healthy omnivorous diet where meat makes up a huge proportion of the diet. I mean, my diet is, I'd say, probably 85 to 90% meat-based. So in summary, humans are a product of the universe. We're a product of the cosmos, molding us via a process of evolution. We used to think evolution was a random event, but we can tell it's not. It's a very ordered process. Mutations don't just happen. They seem to be acting in a way where there's almost some order within that chaos. Modern Neolithic disease is a disconnect from nature, and we've unfortunately built a system the medical, pharmaceutical, industrial complex that benefits from it. So there's no incentive to improve the system because it's $1 trillion industry. There seems to be an ignorance of madness within the medical system because the system's deeply centralized. By nature, by virtue of understanding nature, we know nature is decentralized. She's a decentralized system. A centralized system can never be well. Over time, it decays. And we're watching real time the decay of the central banking system, but we're also watching the decay of human health because we centralized health to the pharmaceutical device industry. The pharmaceutical medical industry, in my opinion, will not restore the wastelands of human health or the destruction of the planet. I think blokes like Jake are the future, not only for the planet, but for human health. We just need more people to come along on the ride and spread the word. This is what drives me every day to get up and post or write blogs or come out and talk to people because we just need to spread the word. Thank you.
Thanks for that. 4.5-year carnivore. Is there any truth, just conventional meat versus grass-fed beef? And is there any truth that some people in the carnivore space are a little worried that the fat of the animal might be accumulating toxins, that's where they might store their toxins in the fat, much as I think perhaps we do. So what happens when we eat them, or is that being filtered out before that?
I think I've made the point before, and I agree with a lot of what Jake's posted as well. I think the healthier the animal is, the better off we are as well. I mean, whilst the meat doesn't accumulate the fat, the muscle tissue, but there is some suspicion that the fat does. I think even more important though, an animal that is grass-fed and finished, the nutrient density within the fat's just high, and hence the difference in colour that you see. That's all vitamin A precursors, as we know. So you're just dealing with a healthier animal. One of my favourite proteins is actually deer, wild-caught deer, and you could just see the nutrient density in the food that you're holding. And a lot of grass-fed finished beef tends to be the same, a lot leaner and probably a lot more nutrient dense. I think the omega-3 to 6 profile's much more favourable as well. I think it just makes sense eating a well animal as opposed to eating a obese marbled animal that has been fed in a feedlot for weeks on end with grains soaked in glyphosate and other pesticides. What does it do to the animal's microbiome? It might not accumulate in the tissue, but I don't think you're dealing with a well animal.
From a farmer's perspective, if I can riff on that for a moment, we know that, well, I know and I observe every day that the animal's health and happiness are interlinked.
Yep.
It's not happy unless it's healthy, and if it's healthy, it's happy. It's a snake eating its tail, like it's a cycle, and that's the energy that we're putting in our body. So I've spoken to, in the last 2 or 3 days, I've probably spoken to 30 people that have told me they can't eat barn-laid eggs, but they can eat pasture-raised eggs. They can't eat factory-farmed pork, but they can eat pasture-raised pork, all these things. We're not going to find the studies that the institutions and the big industries, big farmers done on pasture-raised pork versus factory-farmed pork, because no one cares. It's such a little blip in the radar. But that is the blue rule of anecdote. Experiment on yourself. Build community like this and riff on each other. What makes you feel better? You had hives after you ate eggs. I had that too. How do you fix that? There's so much knowledge getting around through people's lived experience. Who's next?
Thank you.
Pleasure.
In terms of being an enterologist and a gastroenterologist, I'm actually just a bit curious what you think about the space of microbiome testing. So,
Yeah.
to give context, I'm a naturopath.
Yeah.
And I don't do it.
Yep.
Because I feel like we don't have enough information, really.
Yeah.
But I'm just so curious to know that there's probably not that many of your colleagues that are into it.
No, look, I think from what I've seen of microbiome testing, if someone's coming to see you with gut issues and they bring along their microbial testing, almost certainly they'll have overgrowth of the gram negatives, your Clostridial species, your Enterobacter species. So it's always an overgrowth of the bad guys anyway, regardless. I don't use them at all. I don't find them very useful. I'm a bit like you in that regard, because what does it really mean? We don't understand the nature of the microbiome. The microbiome numbers something like 40 trillion cells within that gut system. Just like we don't understand the nature of the cosmos, I don't think we can ever fathom the gut microbiome. But what makes a person generally healthier, right, is probably good for the microbiome, okay? And that's what it is. If you can change someone's diet and they feel better, I don't really care what the microbiome signature is doing, because it's likely to improve anyway. We don't have standardization on that. Yeah.
Is it true microbiome can change in 3 days?
Yeah, it's highly malleable. Okay, so exercise will change it. Exercise increases something called your short chain fatty acids, which the gut loves. And if you fuel the gut the right way, even with your own fat, they can change the microbiome. They did that testing. It was a study done on 14 All Blacks a while ago, and they demonstrated quite clearly that exercise changed the microbiome. What you drink, what you eat influences the microbiome. So if you've had a plant-heavy meal, say for instance, you're obviously going to select for the bacteria that ferment more, right, that help break this down. So it's really what you feed your gut over time. It's a highly malleable, shifts with the day. There's so much shift and change. This is what I'm saying, that you can't just test one moment in time and expect to have any sort of meaningful information from it.
What happens during a long fast?
Yeah, long fast, it'll be very similar to exercise because you're just liberating short chain fatty acid, right? You're breaking down your body fat and liberating ketones, and the gut loves that. It goes through this entire period of recycling. You lose enterocytes, like your entire cell lining. You feed it a high protein diet, basically, of your own gut lining, in addition to a high fat diet from your own fat stores. So that probably is the mechanism why a lot of people feel great on fasting or improve health, is you're increasing short chain fatty acid, which ultimately goes back to the smallest level of our body, which is the mitochondria. It improves the mitochondrial function. So that's how it all works. It all links back up. So.
Thanks. So, I'm just curious if you've had any success talking to either your patients or your colleagues to help them or encourage them to change their views. Like in terms of, most people have trust in the authorities that hand down recommendations and guidelines, and to try to convince someone that the powers that be are feeding you incorrect information. A lot of people are very not receptive to that kind of message. I don't know if you have had any success in that.
Look, it's a great question. Appreciate the question. During the Third Reich, in Nazi Germany, the first profession, or the largest profession, to convert to the teachings of the Nazis were the medical profession. 70% signed up without any coercion, right? And it got me thinking. I read a paper on this, and it got me thinking. I spent a really dark week, actually, after reading that paper, just contemplating it. And I realized something. We don't really select medical students based on intellect and creativity. We select them based on conformity, right? And that's what medicine does. It's a conformist field. And it explains why I was very unhappy through med school. I mean, to be honest, I wagged probably 85% of it. And because none of what they did resonated with me. I was drawn to gastroenterology because it's such a logical field. It's a field of logic. You see a disease, you see it real time with a camera. You see a polyp, you cut it out. It was a very logical field. But to cut a long story short, I haven't had much success with colleagues at all. I think their health needs to hit rock bottom before, or a loved one's health needs to hit rock bottom before they can see the light. Additionally, we're a highly paid field. We're talking, the 0.1% of the population. These are doctors paid hundreds of thousands, some of them millions a year. We're incentivized by disease. So I think it's really hard to get them to shift their mindset. A lot of my colleagues are at an inflammatory bowel disease conference this weekend. One of my good friends who's a gastroenterologist texted me. They were fundamentally talking about what a fringe doctor I've become, and how much of a conspiracy theorist I am. And this is what I'm faced with. Just to give you guys some insight, this is our field. But over time, because I've had a presence on the social media, I've felt compelled to blog and so forth. I've just selected for people that are already converted. So I get people like yourselves who come and see me as patients. They're already there. So we've just got to help them with our dietetics aspect and maybe do a colonoscopy on them to make sure that there's no structural illness. But I've built a community utilizing social media. You can't knock social media because it allows you to build a social, a community around you, for sure.
Thanks, Dr. Pran. The other day, Jacob sent me his price list, and one of the things that struck me is that it was a glaring omission, and there were no crickets on there. So, what's wrong with it?
Mate, I'll tell you something. So I grew up in rural Africa. I was very lucky, actually. Great childhood in Zimbabwe in a little village. It'll be a town now, but it was a village. It's called Bindura. The Africans are awesome people. Like, just genuinely, life was cheap there. People died during childbirth. People died of infectious illness. Medical facilities were really poor. HIV and AIDS was becoming an issue. People would just drop dead early. But they had fun, right? And they were just such genuine, gifted people. They just had the gift of art. And I love the Africans. Love growing up there. They'd eat a lot of bugs, right? Purely because it was a necessity in terms of protein. But when they killed an animal, right, a goat or a cow or something like this, and it was rare, they would celebrate it. The entire community would celebrate it, right? But they'd eat bugs as a staple because that's what was available. I guess I'm not knocking bug protein. I'm sure that they've got a good nutritional profile to them, but is it going to allow people to comply long term to those diets? Can someone do a carnivore diet based on, I'm not saying you need to do a carnivore diet, but say someone needed to, could they do it purely on bug meat? Unlikely, because you don't get the same pleasure from a taste perspective out of it, right? And diets like that you can never adhere to long term. Additionally, there is some data that these bugs can trigger life-threatening allergies in some people, and the allergic profile on them or the immune stimulating profile on them might be a lot higher. Additionally, I'll eat bugs, no problem. So if they want me to eat bugs, great, but I want it regeneratively farmed on Jacob's farm, right? Not, you're doing bugs, Jake? No. So the input equals the output, right? So the question is, where are they feeding these bugs? It's obviously the same feedlot type situation. Ultimately, the animal is what they eat. And there's just no taste to it. And this is why a lot of people that do the vegetarian or vegan pathway, they'll add calories and calories worth of flavoring and sauces and so forth just to make the diet palatable. Even from, and I'll finish up here, I know we're running late, but the Hindu diet, I'm a Hindu by birth, right? Our diet is thought to be legumes and grains and rice based. And we've got this flavorful cuisine, but that was born because of the British colonization took away forest and land from the Indians, right? They took that away, took meat away and paid them in grains. And we had to learn to make the damn thing palatable. So that's where a lot of these flavors from India were born. So this is why I refuse to eat a colonial diet. I eat beef, and that's what my ancestors ate, and I'll honor my ancestors. Yeah.